playing in a practice session or a performance where the notes needed to be played really softly, but try as hard as you might, they either came out too loudly or they didn't come out at all. You see, everybody thinks that it's hard to play loudly, and it's impressive to play loudly on the piano, but it's actually soft playing that is far more difficult. Today we're exploring a crucial skill to build at the piano, and that is playing softly. We're going to jump into why it's so difficult to play softly, the technique that we can use to develop more control, how this is linked to tone and the sound that we create at the piano, and finally some practice methods that we can use to develop this skill as we go ahead. Before we dive into techniques, let's just jump into why this can feel impossible at times. And I think one of the main reasons for me was that when I was doing a lot of practice on a digital piano or an upright piano, I felt like the feel and the touch didn't transfer very well over to a grand piano, and this especially changed the way that I approached and played soft notes. Not only do grand pianos respond slightly differently, but every piano is going to be different as well. So it's about adjusting to the piano that we're going to be playing, and we'll explore a little bit more about this later. On some digital pianos especially, they can create a sound even with the lightest of touches on top of the keys, but if you recreated the same touch on a grand piano or most acoustic pianos, they wouldn't come close to making a sound. So what's the difference here? It comes down to the mechanical action of the piano. Each hammer has about 100 moving parts in it, and if the key isn't struck fast enough, they're not going to complete their sort of mechanical cycle, which is not going to launch the hammer at the string fast enough so that it will hit it, and that will result in no sound. The solution, however, isn't just to press harder, because that's going to create a much louder sound. The key is that the key needs to go down fast enough, but too fast, and we're going to get a louder sound. So we're going to jump into the technique of how to do that in just a moment. Then of course there's practice. Oftentimes it's easy to leave dynamics until after we've learned the notes of the piece, but the problem with doing this is that we're limiting the amount of time that we're spending on practicing dynamics, practicing playing softly, and especially the control that's needed in order to play softly. It's easy to focus on obvious aspects of technique, such as like finger independence or just increasing the speed of our pieces or simply learning notes, than to focus on the control that's needed to play softly. Another thing to think about is the fact that we don't think that it's difficult to play softly, or that's our immediate thought, so it's something that we don't spend enough time on. Finally, we need the right instrument to give us the right feedback in order to learn. For instance, if you play mostly on an upright or on a digital, then you might find that when you do jump on a grand piano, it's going to have a different result in terms of your sound, and you might find that it's harder to produce softer notes. What I always suggest, and this is what I used to do a lot, was to find a venue nearby, such as a church, that has a grand piano that you're able to practice on, and think about these specific things that you need to do on a grand piano that you wouldn't necessarily need to do on an upright or especially a digital. Now that we know why soft playing is difficult, let's focus on the technique that we can use to play soft notes every time. So to play softly and produce a clear and controlled sound, we really need to think about how we're approaching the keys. So try out these 3 steps to playing softly. So the first step is to glide, and this means to not press the key vertically downwards. If you press the key vertically downwards, you're much more likely to have no sound at all. But if you can glide either by going forwards or by coming backwards, you're much more likely to get a sound, and one that is soft also. The next tip is to play through and down. Think of going to the bottom of the key at the piano, and that will avoid you just playing on the surface. When we play on the surface, we're less likely to get a sound. When we go all the way down to the bottom of the key, we're more likely to make the hammer go fast enough to strike the string. So now that we're gliding and we're going down to the bottom of the key, the third step is to involve the whole arm. So play down and through, and use a motion, a movement forwards with the arm, or pulling back depending on which one you're doing, instead of just using the fingers. We're going to come back to fingers in just a moment. Just just to use the fingers is far more difficult. So use the whole arm, create one motion down through, and think about the speed that you're playing the note at. The same technique for soft playing can be used to change the tone or the sound that we create at the piano. But before we jump into that next point, if you're not sure exactly what to play or what to practice when you sit at the piano, check out the 60-minute routine that I've been using for years. It's complete with loads of book recommendations and is available from the link in the description below. So generally we can create either brighter and harsher sounds, or we can use the technique that we've been using today to play really quietly to produce warm, full, rounded and resonant sounds. To create a harsh sound, and this is good for pieces which have lots of accents in, so we want to press the key down very fast and vertically downwards. If you just took it on a chord, you'd press it vertically downwards very quickly. The opposite to this then is the warm sound, and this can be created by just taking the technique that we learned earlier about pressing, gliding, going down to the bottom of the key and trying to make the hammer hit the string slower, but by just using it slightly louder now. If we did the same attack going vertically downwards very quickly, you end up with a much brighter sound, pushing, gliding down to the bottom of the key, and attacking the note, the string slower, will produce that fuller, resonant sound. The more you play around with it, the more you'll be able to control the tone at the piano, and we use them in entirely different places. You could use both in the same piece, but we just want to vary the sound that we create at the piano, just like we vary the dynamics or the timing that we use when we play. So now that we know what the technique is, here are 3 practice strategies for practicing this technique in. And the first one is simply just to take a block chord and play it across the whole dynamic range, right the way from pianissimo to fortissimo. But actually, I'm going to do it the other way around. Let's do it from fortissimo right the way down, so that we can see how quiet we can get as we go. So, for instance, okay, so what I'd suggest you do is go down to whatever you think is pianissimo, and then just keep going until you hit the breaking point. And the breaking point is the point at which it does fail. The sound fails. You're trying to go so softly that you reach the failure point. Now, the more time that you spend around that line, the more you're going to know the instrument that you're playing on. And the more you know that line and where that is, the more you'll be able to transfer that to other instruments as well. The problem is that because it's uncomfortable to fail at that point, not produce sound, it's often uncomfortable and we don't like to spend time there. But that's really where we need to spend the time to really get to know what are the limits that we can go to. So we talked more generally about how to play softly and the technique for playing softly on the piano. And now we can transfer those ideas across to, say, playing a scale. In a scale, we're going to have to rely much more on finger technique, but the theory that we've learned, the mechanics that we understand, are going to be the same for playing a scale as for playing a chord. But we can't rely on the arm and the motion going through and down and through the piano as much, but we can still think about those when we're playing with our fingers. So to begin with, just take a scale and practice it slowly, ensuring that all the notes are as even as possible. And then take that same scale and repeat exercise 1, but instead with a scale. So we're going to play the scale at fortissimo and then all the way down to the breaking point at which we don't get any sound. We're always trying, though, when we're doing the scales, to keep the fingers even throughout. This is just another way of practicing scales. Mastering soft playing and tone is one of the 10 essential techniques that you need to transform your playing. In the next video, we go over the other 9. Please don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.